Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalan Johnson. My guest today is Meredith Carder. Meredith is an ADDCA trained ADHD coach who holds a bachelor's in psychology and a master's in business administration. Meredith's journey with ADHD began when her middle child was diagnosed with ADHD, and she began learning as much as she could about ADHD to help her daughter understand her unique brain. During this process, Meredith discovered she likely also had ADHD as well and later pursued a diagnosis. This journey led Meredith on the process to becoming an ADHD coach because she believed every individual has unique strengths and discovered those areas of brilliance can lead to a happy and full life. So, Meredith, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being my guest.
And thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I gave a brief introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you better, would you mind giving us a little bit of information about your story?
Yeah, of course. So you touched on it a little bit in the intro. I always knew something was different about my brain. I did things differently than a lot of people. And in some ways, I felt like it was a good thing. And then in other ways, I felt like kind of embarrassed about it. But it didn't fit any of the profiles that I was looking at in the mental health space. Like I knew that sometimes I was anxious, but I didn't feel like I had anxiety. Didn't feel like I was depressed. I just really felt my brain was functioning different. And I never really got any clarity on that until my daughter was diagnosed with ADHD. And when I was filling out those questionnaires and the profiles and doing all of the symptom checkers for her, it was literally like light bulbs were going off everywhere. It made total sense that she had ADHD and I had ADHD as well.
Oh, wow. Um, what what was it like, I guess, as a child for you, not knowing what you were experiencing, and then at that point where you had your daughter and filling out that questionnaire, all the light bulbs going off?
Yeah, it was both really I don't know if exciting is the right word, but maybe validating that,
Mm.
oh yeah, something is different here for me. I also sort of felt like, oh my gosh, what might have been had I had this information sooner. So yeah, there was a lot of complications. To circle back to what you asked about, what was it like for me as a child? I went to a really strict Catholic school. So there was like a lot of rules and structure, and my brain did not like rules and structure. And whenever I got in trouble in school, it was because I was like fighting the system. Like there was a rule that didn't make sense for me, or it was talking too much and things like that. Like I liked school, I wanted to learn, but there were a lot of signs that I wasn't that like little girl that they want, just sat in her desk and did what she was supposed to do.
I gotcha. So, based on your experience, how would you define ADHD?
So ADHD, just to like with the words, what it's defined, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That's what those letters stand for. But I feel like it really doesn't encompass all of ADHD at all. ADHD is so many things beyond just hyperactivity and struggling with attention. Those things are very much a part of it, but ADHD is also struggles with emotional regulation. It is struggling with impulsivity and things like that. So there's just so much to it that I probably couldn't even cover in one podcast episode.
Mm. And what was it? I mean, I know you gave a little bit of a description of what it was like to be a child, but what was it that made you finally feel like you had ADHD? Was it that questionnaire you were filling out for your daughter, or was it just kind of realizing things weren't, as I guess, as good as they could have been, maybe.
Yeah, I think, definitely as soon as I started diving into ADHD and learning more about it, everything started to come together. And that's really where I was like looking back and like realizing how much I was struggling in areas. Like I knew I was struggling, but I didn't know why I was struggling. So for me, it definitely all came together when I started like seeing in black and white in front of me all of these symptoms that totally made sense for me. And the more I read about ADHD beyond just like the symptom checklist, the more I was seeing myself in that information.
Wow. Why do you think it's missed so much for children? Um, is it because maybe we just didn't know what to look for, or because society has a certain standard where they think people should be, or like what? Why is childhood ADHD missed so often?
I think there's a lot of reasons. You mentioned a couple of them. Like a lot of people don't really know what they're looking for. There's kind of that stereotype of that little boy that can't stay in his chair or that's like really disruptive in a classroom situation. And people can see that and be like, okay, maybe this is ADHD. But oftentimes, ADHD can present as a child that is quiet and daydreaming. And because they're not a behavioral problem for the teacher or for their parents, they're not on anybody's radar. They're just that kid that like could do so well if they could just pay attention. That's something we hear a lot. Um, Hyperactivity is also not always what we think it is. For me as a child, I look back and I was like, man, I was really hyperactive. But it wasn't like I couldn't stay in my chair. It was, I talked a lot. I talked really fast. I was twirling my hair all of the time. So people look at that type of presentation of hyperactivity and it's not really a problem for them as much. So they're not really like looking to find an answer or treatment. So a lot of time it is just a lack of awareness of different ways it can present and that ADHD inattentive presentation that doesn't have as much of the hyperactivity, that piece is a lot harder to identify because children can't always verbalize like I can't pay attention in school. I'm trying. It looks more like a kid that's unmotivated or a kid that has their head in the clouds. And that's not quite as easy for a child to explain to their parents if they're struggling in that way.
Hmm. That's a lot of good information because I know for me, if I think of ADHD, I think of someone who's like, hyperactive or things like that, but it can also be the opposite. So I'm glad you mentioned that. What are some ways that people were treated before a diagnosis? Like, how can they be labeled? Or, if you're going on, just living your life as a child or, as an adult and you have this condition and you're not diagnosed, people may tend to treat you differently. What are some ways that they can be treated differently or even labeled?
One label I hear people say that they even like self-identify sometimes as being is lazy. A lot of times people will be like, well, that kid is smart. They're just lazy. They're just not living up to their potential. Another one would be scatterbrained. I hear that a lot like, oh, I was just really scatterbrained. Smart but not focused, that type of thing are things I think people hear a lot because oftentimes a child with ADHD and an adult with ADHD, they have some really cool strengths. And if they're in an environment where they can use those strengths, then everything else is just kind of like, ooh, you're this, but if you would only apply yourself, like that kind of conversation starts happening. So I would say those are some of the labels I think that come up. I also think a lot of people with ADHD are labeled as like risk takers, as daredevils, things like that because of that impulsivity piece.
Mm, I see. How difficult can it be living with undiagnosed ADHD?
That is a really good question. And I think it really, really depends on what is your environment. If you are living in an environment in a home where the people around you see you as like a whole person with talents, and they can see your strengths and they kind of accept that about you and focus on that, you probably can do okay. If you are living in an environment where you are constantly like being kind of forced to go against like your natural tendencies, it can be really, really hard. It also is super helpful for kids and for adults to learn strategies and ways to cope with ADHD. And if they're not given that information about how their brain works or those strategies, they're going to always be trying to do things the hard way. So if you don't know you have ADHD, or if you do and you're not like really supposed to talk about it, which is a thing sometimes with parents, or you don't really understand it, you're constantly trying to live in the world in a way that just doesn't make sense for you. So it can be very, very hard. And on a really serious note, people with ADHD can sometimes be more prone to addiction and things like that because their brain is seeking dopamine. And if you don't know like that your brain is seeking dopamine, you're going to look for that dopamine anywhere you can find it. And substances are a fast way to get dopamine. So it can be very, very hard to live with this condition if it's not managed.
Wow. So you mentioned that people with ADHD, their brain is a little different. What
Mm-hmm.
what are some symptoms of ADHD and how does it affect the brain?
So what's going on? I'll start with how the brain is kind of structured differently with ADHD, and I'm not going to be able to cover all of it. I'm not a neuroscience, but I'll talk about it in kind of more colloquial language, so that a broad audience can kind of understand. A lot of times, what is talked about with the differences in the ADHD brain is that our brain doesn't process dopamine in the same way a neurotypical brain does. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is related to motivation, it's related to pleasure, and things like that. So, our brain, long story short, is looking for more dopamine. So, we are constantly seeking out sources of stimulation that provide that. And if we're not getting it, we're not motivated, we're not initiating the tasks we're supposed to be initiating, we're not doing the everyday things that other people feel like a sense of reward for doing because we're just not getting that same sense of reward. So the dopamine deficiency is one hallmark of ADHD. We also have differences in how our prefrontal cortex functions. So that's the area of the brain that controls what are called your executive functions. And I don't have the list in front of me, but there's several executive functions that have to do with like perception of time and organization and emotional regulation and things like that. So those skills are different for us with ADHD, and they present in symptoms like that impulsivity. Like we don't have that pause button that a lot of people have. It can show up as hyperactivity in a lot of different ways. It can show up as like an inability to tolerate boredom because our brain like really is looking for that stimulation all of the time.
Wow. It, there's so many things that ADHD is that I think a lot of us never would have even known what it was had it not been for the research and for people who have it that have been fighting for something more. And now, because there's such a broad level of research that has been done, you get to see the full picture of what it is and what it
Mm-hmm.
isn't. And I think that that is so helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there are so many different ways it presents, and there's so many different symptoms, and they impact people so differently based on their environment. So many people have been like getting by okay, but also like really like struggling underneath the surface. And because it wasn't really talked about for a long time, it was just thought of in the context of children, which it is really important that we identify it in children. But for a long time, people kind of just thought you grew out of it. And symptoms do change and evolve over a lifetime for many people, but ADHD doesn't typically go away. An ADHD child grows into an adult with ADHD. And because we only were looking at it through that one lens of like this one stereotype of the small child that's super hyper, a lot of people were not receiving the help that they deserved.
Now, you said a lot of us think that ADHD is only something that's seen in children. So if you're a child that has ADHD and you grow into an adult with ADHD, do you learn to manage, or is it more so that you've learned to cope?
I think it can be both. Um,
Mm.
I definitely think that there are some, you know, things that you really can manage and strengthen in terms of like how your brain is wired. Like you can improve decision making skills. You can improve that tendency to be like a black and white thinker. You can learn to like see more nuance. Like our brains, can be kind of rewired to improve in certain areas. So a lot of the like behavioral, cognitive behavioral therapy and things like that can help with that. Um, there are some things that are harder to shift. And if you can identify those and create coping mechanisms, you can lessen the impact they have so that they're not overwhelming your whole life. So I'll give like a more like kind of real world example of what I mean. So I'm pretty impulsive. I talk a lot. I talk fast, especially when I'm excited. And that's something I can work on to a degree. Like I can take speaking classes, I can work on awareness of that. But I can also look at that and be like, in what areas is this actually causing me a problem? And be like, okay, in this area at the corporate world, I need to be able to slow down. But I don't really need to mask this around my friends. I can just kind of be me. This isn't harming anything. So there is some like just evaluating where you want to put your effort. There's also just identifying like what's super, super hard for you. So like everybody with ADHD is different. But for me, like home organization is really, really hard. Like I can like get clutter out of my way, but my strategy for that is like taking all of the clutter and throwing it in a closet in a pile so I never have to see it again. And the idea of opening that closet and like doing anything about it is so overwhelming for me. So I can look at that and be like, I don't really need somebody to come like clean my house for me, but I need to hire an organizer. So it's like putting your resources in the place that makes the most sense for you. Like this thing isn't that hard for me, but this thing is really hard. So if I'm going to choose to help myself and put resources in one area, this is where I'm going to put the resources. So I think that understanding is a way to like create the best way to cope so that those things that are hard for you, you're not trying to do all of the hard things all of the time. And it gives you more space to do the things that you're actually good at.
Mm, that's great advice. You mentioned something about having to be a certain way, maybe in the corporate world, but then with your friends, you can be who you are. Do you think there's a lot of pressure on people with ADHD to try to be different or to mask what may be symptoms of ADHD in certain environments?
Oh my gosh, there's a lot of pressure. I definitely, and some of us get really, really good at the masking. But the problem is that sometimes it really takes a toll. And we might even overestimate how much we need to mask. Like we get to that point where like we're like almost like a perfectionist as like a coping mechanism because we do feel so much pressure and we probably have put ourselves in positions where we were embarrassed or felt shame. So we really, really feel that pressure to mask. I've worked in and out of the corporate world for my whole career, and it's incredible how different each environment can be. Like I've worked in corporate spaces where they, were strength based and they looked at every single employee and like tried to focus on what they're good at and what they can contribute. But it's not always like that. There's other spaces where they're like, we're going to give you a bunch of rules. We want you to follow it exactly like this. And even if there's not really a huge benefit to that, you're kind of expected to fit the mold. And those types of spaces can be really, really hard for people with ADHD because most of the time they can do the job, but they're going to have to do it a little bit differently. And if they're not given that freedom to do it differently, like they have to mask, and that is exhausting at times and can impact their productivity overall.
Hmm. Okay, I wanted to ask a question. and I just thought about this because now you're a mother with a daughter who has ADHD and you are aware. How do you now take your experience and your knowledge to benefit your daughter where maybe you didn't get that?
I am lucky, just in case my mom listens to this. I had really great parents that even though they didn't know I had ADHD, they did encourage my curious nature and they did like really focus on what I was good at. So I do that with my daughter as well. And I look at her and I'm constantly reminding myself that I am raising a whole person. I'm not just raising a person that I need to be successful in school and get straight A's. She's redefining what successful is for her, and it doesn't have to look the same as the rest of society. I am teaching her about her tendencies with how her brain is wired. Like she's a teenager now and she likes to shop a lot. So, a lot of teenage girls like to shop. But for my daughter, I'm definitely noticing that it's out of boredom a lot of times. And that's a very common behavior with people with ADHD is we are looking for that like feeling of pleasure from shopping because our brain is just understimulating. So when I see her just being like, okay, what can I buy? She's out of money. You know what I mean? She's like looking to spend my money. And I'll talk to her about that. I'll be like, let's take a pause and let's see what you really need in this moment. Like, do you need to go hang out with a friend? Do we need to go take a walk? Like, is there another way to get the need met that you're trying to meet with a behavior that might be a little bit destructive to you at a point? And creating that awareness for her. Whereas, like, I never knew why I spent so much money and I had shame about that, where I'm guiding her and helping her understand this is how your brain works. You don't need to feel bad about this tendency, but this tendency might have an impact that you don't like. So let's learn a productive way to get that need met. So that's kind of how it works with her. I think it's really important. Um, if you are a parent listening to this with a child with ADHD, that you don't hide the fact that their brain is wired differently from them, that you work on educating yourself and your kid about what is going on and look at it with acceptance and then focus on the things that they are doing well and that you can develop and then give them coping strategies for those things that are maybe going to have an impact they don't want to have on their life.
Well, that was super good. Um, Another question I want to ask is there a spectrum for ADHD?
It's not typically diagnosed as much on a spectrum as like autism spectrum disorder is, but it is definitely widely thought that there's a different variety of how much this presents for people. There are definitely people who are very, very highly impacted by ADHD and people that are less impacted. So typically what I hear from like a diagnostic standpoint from professionals is mild, moderate, or severe ADHD. But there is absolutely, I think, a variety of how it presents, and then it's influenced beyond that based on like environment and things like that.
Mm. The reason why I wanted to ask that question was because when you mentioned some of the things that ADHD can present as, like boredom, or like I was under the impression that if you had ADHD you were super hyper, but it can also be the opposite. So I think just knowing what to look for based on the information that's available now can be helpful for parenting or even adults who maybe filling out a questionnaire for their daughter, and the
Yeah.
questionnaire kind of lights up to them as well. So
Yeah. And I think one thing that I'd like to add to that is beyond it just being on a spectrum, is that there are right now three different presentations of ADHD. There is the ADHD predominantly hyperactive type, which is kind of the stereotype people think of where the
mm,
hyperactivity is very present. And then there is ADHD inattentive type. So that's a type where the hyperactivity is not as present and like the focus and symptoms of inattention are more predominant. And then there's combined type, which means you have symptoms of both. So that's, I think, really important for people to know when they're looking at ADHD is that you don't have to have that hyperactivity at all. You could be an attentive type. And that's actually, like, if you hear people talking about ADD, that's kind of the colloquial term to describe that inattentive type. But that ADD term has not been used in diagnostic criteria for a really long time, but it's kind of still hanging out. And it's just another way to say ADHD inattentive type.
I gotcha. Thank you for that. Um, Now, for people who have been living with this and they've had to mask or adjust in social circles or at work or in school, once they are at the point of receiving a diagnosis or just thinking that they could possibly have ADHD, is there a lot of shame and embarrassment that is typical that they feel?
Yeah, I think that shame is something that comes up all the time for people with ADHD, whether they're diagnosed or not. There is still a huge stigma out there regarding ADHD. Uh, there are people that don't think ADHD is real. They think it is just people wanting to label themselves or have an excuse for certain behaviors. So there's a lot of people, unfortunately, that come to the realization that they have this and they're living in a family unit where they talk about that and they're kind of dismissed or they're told that they're seeking attention. And that's a great way for a lot of shame to manifest, right? And I do think that even if you are in a pretty supportive environment and you realize you have ADHD, there can be this moment of looking back at your life and being like, okay, wow, I did mess up a lot over here. I did have all of these behaviors that I didn't know how to explain. And it kind of makes you do this whole looking back at your life and reminding yourself of everything that didn't go well. And that can feel shameful too and bring up a lot of feelings. So shame is really complicated, but I think there's a lot of reasons that people with ADHD are very ashamed because their strong suit usually isn't home organization. Sometimes we're late. Sometimes we struggle with saying the wrong thing and interrupting. And those are all things that society makes us feel ashamed about. So it certainly is a big struggle for a lot of people with ADHD.
Gotcha. Now, if someone was to suspect that maybe they do have ADHD, how would they go about finding out or getting a diagnosis?
So it depends on where you live. If you is most of your audience in the US, or do you have listeners everywhere right now?
I just checked and I'm in I think 21 countries. So,
Okay, that's pretty cool.
but for the
So
most
it
part, the
really
US. So,
Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the US, and I know a little bit about how it works in the UK as well because I have a lot of clientele there. So I'll touch on those too because those are probably a big chunk of your listenership. But typically in the US, you would want to talk to either your general practitioner for a referral to a psychiatrist or go directly to a psychiatrist. Any MD can technically diagnose you with ADHD, but most of the time people want that psychiatric assessment to really know because there's a lot of other things that could be going on that present similarly to ADHD that you want to rule out or that can present alongside ADHD. So getting an appointment with a psychiatrist is really, really helpful. A lot of times you might struggle to find a provider that is ADHD informed. I think it's really, really important to try to find that because a lot of providers, aren't as used to seeing it in adults. So definitely would recommend doing your homework. If you are in the UK, the National Health Service, I've heard it's a really long wait to be assessed through the National Health Service. But I always recommend that if you're thinking about it and you're in that area to just get on the list because, 2 years is going to go by anyway. You might as well be getting closer to having an answer. Some people can also do a private assessment, but that is very costly. So it's really just, dependent on if you can afford that, if you're, if you want to, invest in that, if you can afford it. So there's an accessibility issue there. And then other countries, it really seems to depend. I would definitely recommend, if you have suspicions, start seeing if you can find people in your community that have experience with it that can like guide you to the right professionals. I also think it's worth saying, if you do get that appointment wherever you live, one thing that I would highly recommend is to create a list of the symptoms you're experiencing and then provide examples of the different areas of your life it's impacting. So how is this impacting you at work? How is this impacting you at home? And then also creating a second list of how these symptoms impacted your childhood. Because something that happens, I think pretty typically, is people go in for their interview and they're asked, how did you do in school? And they said, I did pretty good. And it's not actually uncommon for people with ADHD to do well in school. Our brains are driven by interest. So if we like school, if we have good educators that are engaging our brain, a lot of times we do really well. So I have heard of people being dismissed immediately if they say, yes, I did good in school. But you can do well in school and still have struggles in that environment. So being clear on that and having examples, I think, is really helpful to getting the correct diagnosis.
What? Just to circle back to what you said. So, school for people with ADHD, the clients that you work with, how, like you said, some of them may say that they did well in school if they were interested. But what if you weren't interested in school? What is the school environment like, or can it be like for people with ADHD from your experience?
Yeah, I think that interest is the key. So oftentimes you'll also see with kids with ADHD that they'll have like all A's in certain subjects throughout their whole school career and then F's. Like there's no in between. They're not like a C student. They're like an A student or a D student. Like for me, for my personal example is I like science. I like social studies. I love to write. So in those types of fields, I like easily would get an A. I didn't know how to study though. I was good at soaking up the information and taking a test, but like if I had to like actually study for it, I was in trouble. I wasn't as good at math. So, and I wasn't interested in math. So there's not much I could do to like excel in that area. So when you see that kid that's like, it's very confusing when you look at their report card. You're like, okay, you're over here and you're like very high in some areas and then you're very low in some areas. ADHD might need to be on the radar. If a kid is just bored overall, or they got really behind in their early years, so now they have all these stories in their head that school is really boring and they hate it, then they're that kid that you can have a conversation with and be like, wow, this kid is really interesting. Why can't they do good in school? Like your teachers are typically very confused by these kids because they see a kid that their IQ is fine. They should be able to do it, but they just can't. So they're labeled as that kid that like isn't meeting their potential or would do so well if they just applied themselves. So like if you're seeing comments like that on a report card, that's a red flag.
Hmm, I got you. Is there any medication that can help with ADHD?
Yeah, a lot of people find a lot of relief from medication. It doesn't cure your ADHD, you still have ADHD, but there are some stimulant medications that really help people with like the focus piece specifically. And then there are non-stimulant options that help as well. I'm not a doctor, so I can't really like give a ton of guidance or opinions on that, but it is an option for many people, for children and for adults, if you're needing support in that area.
For people who do take medication, like clients that you've worked with, what are some feelings and emotions that they experience when they've struggled their whole life with ADHD and they take medication for the first time and it helps them?
Yeah, and a lot of the things I hear is that people have a feeling of like, oh my gosh, my brain feels so much calmer. Like my brain, people with ADHD oftentimes are just being bombarded with tons of different ideas. Like the ideas are flowing, but we're just not able to hang on to them. People often describe them, they start taking medication, they can actually like grab an idea and follow through on it versus like that constant like bouncing around and switching. People also tend to report feeling a lot less exhausted at the end of like a work or school day. If you're trying to get through unmedicated and you're constantly redirecting your attention, that's just mentally exhausting. A lot of people find that when they're on medication and they don't have to do that, um, they feel like they have a ton more energy for other things in their life. As far as like the feelings people express, a lot of people are like, is this what neurotypical people feel like? Like, is this normal? Like a lot of people will be like, wow, is this how normal people's brains? And I say the word normal in, quotes because I like to use neurotypical, but it can get clunky. But they're like, is this how everybody else feels? And for a lot of people, it's a great feeling to feel like they finally have a tool, that can help them. And then for a lot of other people, and it also can be both, they feel like, man, I wish I would have had support like this sooner. Like what could my life have been like if I just had this tool to use? So I think it can be a mixed bag of emotions for sure.
Hmm. Is it common to hear people say that things make so much more sense now once they get to a point where they have that, I guess, that tool to help them stop the quiet their brains, or stop the noise and be able to follow through on an idea, like you said?
Yeah, it's actually really funny that you phrased that question that way, because it is very common. And it's so common that I'm actually currently writing a book. I don't know if I've told you this, but it's called It All Makes Sense Now. So it's that common that I thought it was a good name to call my book. And it is, I would say, like, that phrase is one I hear all the time, or like all the puzzle pieces are fitting together, all the light bulbs are going off. My whole life makes sense. It's definitely very common because there's a lot of confusing things about ADHD. And like we've talked about earlier in this conversation, a lot of them aren't talked about. So people know they're different. They know they're functioning different. And when you put all of these different symptoms and you see them as a whole, you're like, whoa, I'm fitting all of these. And I never knew this for 20, 30, 40 years. So it is kind of a jarring and exciting experience for a lot of people at the same time.
You mentioned that in some families, ADHD is something that can't be talked about. So for somebody to go through their whole life
Mm-hmm.
living like that and now get to a point where it all makes sense, um, some might be angry or feel, like they were
Mm-hmm.
shortchanged. What are some tools and guidance that you give for clients that feel that way?
Yeah, I mean, that is really hard. I feel like if there's a lot of like resentment, there's a lot of like just emotional pain. I think working with a trained therapist sometimes first to like kind of undo some of that trauma can be really, really helpful because you probably do have some trauma in your life from being different from your family and the people around you, creating shame around these things and that resentment and those feelings are valid, but if you don't know how to process them, which a lot of times with ADHD we struggle with emotional regulation, those emotions can be really, really strong, and getting some tools to work through them can be really, really helpful. And I think a licensed therapist is a really good place to take that. I also think that if you're doing some therapy, if you're working on that, finding spaces where you are understood and accepted for who you are is hugely helpful. We can talk to our family, we can try to help them understand, and I do know a lot of people have made progress in educating the people around them, and that takes time. But there are people that are just not going to be accepting. So if you find that your primary spaces are like that, find spaces that you can be in that are different. Find like an ADHD community that you can be a part of. Talk to your friends that you think might have ADHD. You might find that they do too, and having people that you can relate to that accept you. And even if they're not other people with ADHD, find the people that you truly can be authentic with. And I think that can be really healing if you can't find that within your family.
I think that would be so important. Now, is it for people who have struggled with ADHD, right? Is it commonplace or is it encouraged to rewrite narratives that they've had about themselves so that they can begin to have self compassion for themselves later?
100% important. I think that that's one of the most important things, actually. Um, if you've spent your whole life like shaming yourself for doing things differently, for, perceiving yourself as lazy, you need to look at that narrative and understand that you've been like trying to do life with a disability your whole life and figure out how to reframe that. Lots of reframing, I think, needs to happen so that you can feel that compassion for yourself. I think that's actually one of the top things, other than educating yourself about your brain, but learning to build that self compassion and learning to reframe your symptoms, and restructure your life in a way that you're not shaming yourself all of the time. You're not doing all of the things just because you should do them a certain way. You're doing them the way that works best for you. But first, we have to get out of those stories that tell us we have to do things a certain way. So, yeah, absolutely. Super important.
Hmm. What are some strengths, some big strengths that people with ADHD have where they may have felt like they were not so strong because of maybe a disadvantage that they had?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I could talk about this for like the rest of the day. So if I go on too long, like give me a signal. But you know, we're all different. We all have different strengths, but there are some that are commonly talked about for ADHDers in particular. A lot of people with ADHD are ideas people. Like we're awesome brainstormers. Like our brains are moving fast. So we've got like an influx of ideas. We also we don't filter information out as as well as a neurotypical brain. And I say well, like with some emphasis on it, because um, it's hard for us to focus because we are taking in so much information because the filters in our brain are kind of like letting it all in. But because of this, that means that things that a neurotypical brain tunes out, we don't tune out as much. So we start to notice relationships that other people don't notice. We can put like dots together that other people can't always connect. So from a strength based perspective, that's really helpful in the workplace. Like we might have that answer that nobody could grab until we like looked at it a little differently. So just being a divergent thinker, I think, can be really, really helpful because we are bringing a different perspective. A lot of people are creative with ADHD. Not everyone, identifies this way, but I think it's a pretty strong skill that many of us have. And a lot of times it's because our brain is kind of like always running a script in the background. Like it is thinking about so many things. So we can be really creative. Gosh, what other strengths? A lot of us are super resilient, especially because we have had to find ways to exist in a world that's like kind of created for a neurotypical brain. So we get really good at finding workarounds, finding hacks, finding ways to exist in the world and thrive. So I think that's a really cool thing. A lot of us have like a high justice sensitivity. Like we it's like an emotional regulation thing, but it's hard for us to see other people suffering. It's hard for us to see unfairness. And that might get you in trouble as a kid in school if you have a strict teacher that's like, hey, everyone's in trouble for this one kid that's breaking the rules. But in the real world, that means that we can be great advocates, that we can really like be a voice for people that need us to stick up for them. So I think that's really a cool one too. And curiosity, that's before I like stop rambling here. Curiosity is a huge one. And I think that this is one that I have failed. I've never met an ADHDer that's not curious. And if they're not curious, it's because they've had to like condition themselves out of it. But just based on how our brain is looking for stimulation and looking for that dopamine, it's chasing interest. So that makes us super curious. It means we like look at everything and we want to ask more questions. We want to learn more about different random topics. Like if you meet somebody with ADHD, they probably can tell you random facts about the weirdest stuff. So that's like, I think, pretty entertaining. And I think it helps us, also like kind of lends itself to empathy because we have learned a lot about a lot of different things and can really just chase that information all of the time. So I definitely think curiosity is a great, great strength of ADHDers.
Gotcha. Now, something that we mentioned earlier was rewriting narratives for um, maybe being tough on yourself your whole life for
Mm-hmm.
having what you may have considered was a disadvantage. What are some ways that someone can now say to themselves, okay, because I mean that's traumatic. It is for sure trauma that you experience. Um, what are some tools and some ways for someone to now give themselves self compassion and to have grace on their experience?
If we're talking about like specific tools, I think something specifically for ADHDers that can really be helpful is having a way to externalize things that they're feeling and thinking, and the stories in their head. Because a lot of times we're just in our head a lot, like we're in our thoughts a lot. And we need a way for those thoughts to get out. So a lot of ADHDers do really well with like doing a brain dump, like if they're having negative thoughts and negative stories in their head, writing things down, even if it doesn't make any sense, it's not in a logical sentence, just words, and getting it out can really help. Having people that you can verbally process with can really help as well, like finding that trusted person that you can say, hey, I need to process through this. I don't really want advice. I just want to hear myself talk through it. And then oftentimes when we're doing that, if we're saying to ourselves, like, oh my gosh, I'm so lazy, and you're saying this to like another person, you're hearing yourself say that. And then you're thinking, and they might be like, well, what did you do today? And you're like, well, I walked the dog. I took 3 kids to school. I did homework. Like our brain isn't hanging on to all the things that we're doing right. It's only hanging on to the things we're doing wrong. So if we have someone we can kind of process through with, we're like putting the evidence out into the world that's going to give us the evidence we need to start changing the script. So having some kind of external way to process, I think, is really, really helpful. I also think putting into practice some way to like celebrate your wins on a daily or weekly basis is super important for us. So, again, a lot of times we're like living in the now or not now with ADHD, and we might like have done something really cool, but we don't pause long enough to like soak it in or say it or put it out in the world. And we've like kind of forgot it happened the next moment or the next hard thing that comes along. So, finding a group that you like meet with weekly to say, hey, what was your win this week? Like writing your wins down, posting on social media about your wins, just celebrating all the wins all the time, I think creates motivation and helps us have that tangible evidence that we are doing things right and gets us out of that negative.
That's good advice. I want to ask a personal question. After your diagnosis, do you feel like you were able to now see things more clearly? And I guess, were you able to kind of hone in on your strengths more so than you were able to prior because of now knowing?
Oh, absolutely. I think I mentioned earlier, like I grew up with parents that were like pumping up the things that I was good at. But as an adult, when you're like living life every day and you're not good at a lot of like adulting type things, you start to forget about that stuff. So I think that getting that diagnosis and just feeling validated that the things that were hard for me really are hard for me. Um, and a lot of I'm kind of be sidetracked here for a second, but with ADHD, a lot of times we say the things that are hard for us are easy for others, and the things that are easy for us are hard for others. And when you have that and you can look at that and like make sense of it, it really empowers you to stop worrying so much about the things that are hard for you and being okay with accepting help for those things. Like we're spending a lot of energy being mad that things that are hard for us shouldn't be hard for us. And if we can like just like know this, then we can be like, okay, I'm gonna get help with this, or I'm gonna lower my standards in this area. And I'm gonna dive in to the things that are easy for me and that are hard for others. And then you have this opportunity to like fill spaces with your true talents. So it's definitely freeing for me to like know that I wasn't just like failing at adulting, that no, certain adulting tasks really are hard for me. I am not alone in this. I can get help here and make them more manageable. And then I have more brain space to do the things I'm great at and chase that.
Oh, that's great. Okay, another question. Let's say someone with ADHD um, is single, or they're married, or what have you, and they want to either explain to a potential partner or help their existing partner understand what ADHD feels like. How would you describe to someone what it's like to have ADHD who doesn't have it so that they can better understand, to better help you, um, just to manage and to be a better partner?
Gosh, in the context of relationships, there's a lot of things I think that come up. I think that I would start with, especially if we're talking, like I'm kind of assuming in this conversation that it's an ADHD partner and a neurotypical partner, correct?
Right.
Like two people whose brains are wired differently. I think I would start with um, trying to help a partner or friend understand that our energy cycles are completely different. Like we will be hyper focused on something and then we will need to recover. Um, and that we can't really be held to the same standard. And that doesn't mean that we're not going to contribute as much. We're just going to contribute differently. I also would want a partner to truly know how difficult it is for us to regulate our emotions, that our emotions come very strong and fast. Um, and that we sometimes have to like be able to have space to employ a tool to get emotionally regulated before we can move forward. I think that emotional regulation piece is something that really can impact relationships. Where if the ADHD partner is really dysregulated and the neurotypical partner is like, let's full steam ahead, like we're not getting anything done until that partner gets regulated. And, you know, people without ADHD also struggle with emotional regulation at times. So understanding though that like we need to take space sometimes to come back regulated is super helpful. I also think that we just want our partners to know that we want to contribute. We are trying really hard sometimes, and that we are not trying to use our ADHD as an excuse. If we are explaining an ADHD impact to a partner or a friend, it's so they can understand the reason why this is hard. And it doesn't mean that we don't want to contribute or try and like lessen the impact that that has. We're just trying to help them see a window inside of how our brain works, not try to make excuses. A lot of times when I talk to couples, they're like, they're using ADHD as an excuse for everything. And that's a really hurtful thing to hear as a person with ADHD. So I would say just listen to your partner, go into it, you know, with an open mind and allow them to be seen and collaborate on how you guys can accomplish your goals together versus like trying to do everything in a way that only works for one of the people in the relationship.
Nice. Great advice again. Okay, so if you could use your platform to encourage someone who may be struggling with undiagnosed symptoms of ADHD, or someone who was just diagnosed and now kind of feels like, they're lost and they don't know what to do or where to begin, what would you say?
I first would encourage you to understand that you're not broken. Um, there's nothing wrong with you. Your brain is just wired differently. And I would really tell people that are struggling with a new diagnosis and they don't know where to go or what to do to spend some time really diving into what ADHD means for them and start identifying what they want, how they want to change their world to fit with how their brain is wired. A lot of times you're so hopeless because you have been trying to fit a square peg in a round hole your whole life. How can we change that up? How can we create a new environment that's going to allow you to thrive instead of trying to fix something inside of you? How can we fix what's set up around you to make it work better for how your brain is wired?
Hmm, that was great, great advice. I think that this was such a special episode for me because I wanted to be able to use my platform in any way that I could to really give light to the fact that, ADHD is real and that people have been struggling with it for so long, but there are people who are managing their ADHD. There are tools that are out there, and there's help for people that need help and are struggling.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're bringing this to your platform because, like you said, ADHD is real. And if you are living with ADHD and you don't have any support and understanding of how your brain works, it's going to be hard. And it still might be hard, but it can be less hard if you build that self compassion and create the environment that your brain best thrives in. So, thank you again for talking about this. I think the more the community, pushes this conversation out there, the more people are going to feel seen and understood and feel less stigmatized. So I'm so glad we were able to connect on this.
I agree. I'm so grateful you were able to do this with me, Meredith. Where can people find you online or on social media?
So sorry, my my favorite place to hang out is on Instagram. My handle is hummingbird underscore ADHD. I'm showing up there usually like 5 days a week, so there's always something new. That would be the first place to go. I typically have a link in my profile with what I'm currently offering. I do have a community for adults with ADHD that's a low monthly fee where we do like Monday planning meetings. We do kind of some support group and community chat type stuff. So if you are looking for other adults that understand, check that out as well. But would definitely love to connect with you on social media. I try to get to as many of my DMs as I can. So if you do have like a specific question out of this conversation, please find me there.
And also, you mentioned a book.
Yeah, so it's going to be a long time coming, but right now we're scheduled to be released not this coming summer, but next summer. So it's in the process. We're working on it. I'm about halfway done right now. So, books take a long time to be born. But if you're interested in what that process is like for me as well, I'll be talking more about that on social media and talking about what it's like to do kind of this like longer term self-directed project with ADHD because that can be a challenge. We've got all these creative ideas, but getting them out in the world can be hard for us. So if you're interested in that journey, definitely follow me there.
Nice. Okay, Meredith. Well, again, thank you so much for this. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for the work that you've done for everyone that needs to hear this, that has ADHD, that's struggling. Um, Thank you for giving your platform and using everything that you do use on social media to to give people a voice that need it. To put so much information in the world that allows people to understand that they may be different, but that there's nothing wrong with them. So I'm grateful for that. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for, helping me reach even more people and everything you are doing to just talk about mental health in general. Like the more we talk about all of these things, the less alone we all feel. So thanks again.